Hello friends, what's up? It's Jaime here. Welcome back to part 2 of my Avoiding Terrible Queer Tropes video. If you haven't watched part 1, I highly recommend that you do so. I gave some disclaimers and discussed some additional tropes in that video. I'll have it linked down below in the description if you're interested. Now let's get into part 2. This next trope I wanted to talk about, it's pretty self-explanatory, but I wanted to discuss some of the gray areas in regards to this topic. So next we are going to talk about antagonizing queer and trans characters. Now this is different from having queer-coded villains such as Disney's Ursula, Captain Hook, Scar, etc, etc. And while I can't say that I'm particularly a fan of queer coding villains because it still does perpetuate this idea that queerness is inherently evil, even if only on a subtle level, I do recognize that the characters I mentioned before, as well as other queer-coded villains, are really a product of the times due to the Hays Code, which the Hays Code, in case you don't know, was a general set of censorship guidelines that Hollywood was supposed to follow, like no swearing, no nudity, and in this case, it also disallowed positive depictions of queer characters in media. Queer and queer-coded characters could only be depicted as villains and had to be continuously punished and condemned throughout the story. The bury your gays trope is also kind of a byproduct of the Hays Code as well, in the sense that it's like, yeah, you can have your gay character in your story, but they have to die at the end, or something really traumatic and horrible has to happen to them that prevents them from having like a happy ending like the rest of the characters. Now the Hays Code was mostly applied to films between the 1930s and the 1960s, but even as the Hays Code began to lose its influence, the precedents set by the code still very much influenced the media that was made after the era of the Hays Code. So queer-coded characters were still very much a thing even after the Hays Code was really being enforced, particularly in media aimed towards children. Anyway, what I'm talking about specifically when I say antagonizing queer and trans characters is always having your queer and trans characters do just the most terrible, heinous shit, regardless of whether or not they are the primary antagonist. Like, specifically, having your queer and trans characters always being bad people. Like, listen, queer and trans characters are allowed to be the villains. They are allowed to be the protagonists. They do not always have to be the good guys. They don't always have to be the epitome of like morality or anything like that. However, if it's always, and I'm talking about always, your queer or trans characters who are the villains, who are the bad guys, whereas your cis straight characters are the heroes of the story. They're the ones with the moral high ground, or they're just generally better people. For me personally, that like makes me go like, ugh, you know? Because to me, that perpetuates the narrative that queerness or transness can be conflated with being immoral or having a bad character, especially if that is the only queer or trans character that you have in your story. It's kind of almost as if there's like suddenly like a microscope on them and their actions. And this becomes especially problematic if you then have your queer or trans character use their queerness or transness as means to do something terrible or to justify their bad behavior. For example, Monet from the Gossip Girl reboot. It's okay that she treats her partners, or really more so the women in her life, because it feels a bit strong to refer to them as her partners, but anyway, it's okay that she treats them like objects because she's queer. It's okay for women to be treated like shit when it's a woman who is treating them like shit. It's okay that Cheryl from Riverdale stalked Josie and caused her to fear for her life because she was just struggling with her sexuality and trying to find herself. She was just lost. Don't get me wrong, I've known plenty of queer people who were awful in my personal life, public figures. Queerness doesn't absolve you from all forms of bigotry or just being a generally bad person. However, when you conflate queerness or transness with being a bad person, it sends the message that queerness or transness is what makes someone a bad person, and not that being a bad person makes you a bad person. And during a time where raging conservatives are desperately pushing the narrative that queer and trans people are groomers, they're a threat to your kids, they're out for your kids, and are actively utilizing those narratives to pass legislation to strip the rights away from members of our community, are those really narratives that you want your characters to reinforce? Again, queer and trans characters can be messy and flawed and not always make the best decisions and not always be the best people, but I implore you to please think twice before presenting your queer or trans characters as morally bankrupt or irredeemably evil, especially if they are your only queer or trans character in your story. And finally, we have probably one of, if not the most notorious trope involving queer and trans characters in fictional media, and that is the bury your gays trope. Or similarly, the queer characters always being the ones that have tragic storylines and tragic endings, regardless of whether or not that ending means death. Now, ask most people within the queer community, and most of them will agree that the bury your gays trope is problematic. And while queer people do often experience hardships due to homophobia, as well as other things, and while unfortunately there are many instances in which queer people are met with violence to the point of death, it's not as though tragedy and violence are the only things that queer people can experience. The bury your gays trope, or the tragic gays trope, which I consider to be kind of like a subcategory or like adjacent to the bury your gays trope, conflate tragedy and violence with the queer experience, which implies that these are the only outcomes that queer people can expect from their lives. And again, while there are many cases in which queer and trans people are taken from us much too soon, there are also many instances where members of our community are able to grow old and live full, rich lives. Queer and trans joy exists and should be recognized and highlighted. Now, like I said, the bury your gays trope is generally frowned upon. It's probably the most well-known trope out of the ones that I've mentioned across these videos. But what if I told you that I actually think that there are exceptions in which the bury your gays trope isn't completely problematic? The reason I say this is because a while back I saw an Instagram post, which was a repost of a Tumblr post, in which the original poster made the argument that there are certain narrative scenarios in which the bury your gays trope isn't completely problematic. Essentially, that post made the argument that the solution to the bury your gays trope should be, instead of just always keeping your queer and trans characters alive, the actual solution should be that you just keep your queer and trans characters on the same playing field as all your other characters. That all your characters have an equal chance of living or dying, regardless of whether they are queer or trans or cis or straight. And I must say that I do agree with that argument, because there are certain genres where a stark unwillingness to kill off certain characters at some point becomes unrealistic and the plot armor becomes very apparent. For example, if you're writing something within the horror genre, people are gonna die. That's kind of a really big part of horror. Now, obviously, if you're familiar with the bury your gays trope, then you're probably very well aware that this trope is particularly prevalent within the horror genre. So my suggestion, I'm not saying that this is what you have to do or this is what you should do, it's just a suggestion, is to incorporate multiple queer characters within your horror cast. Or you could have an entire queer horror ensemble, play around with it, see what works best. The one thing you just don't want to do is kill off your one singular gay character first. Negative points if you kill them off in an excessively gruesome or violent way, but don't do the same with your straight characters. Like, come on. Come on now, do better. The same thing goes for if you're writing an apocalyptic or post-apocalyptic story like The Walking Dead or The Last of Us. The fun thing about post-apocalyptic worlds and stories is that besides like the main character, and even then not always, no one is safe. The world has gone to shit in whatever way you've designed, and anyone can die at any moment. I'm of the opinion that, again, as long as everyone is truly on the same playing field and that anyone can die at any time, and you aren't singling out your queer or otherwise marginalized characters or being particularly cruel with how those characters meet their ends, I say it's fair game. And as someone who primarily writes stories that are high fantasy, I say that the same thing also applies to the fantasy genre. Now, I'm not the kind of writer who kills off characters excessively, that's just not how I write, but I'm not afraid to kill off characters when the story calls for it, regardless of who they are. I mean, I'll probably cry after, but I will do it. Hey, just because I'm willing to kill off characters sometimes doesn't take away from the fact that I'm a sensitive being, okay? Anyway, as a writer, I would just say use your best discretion when it comes to killing off your queer and trans characters. Obviously, stories can become less fun when the plot armor is super obvious and apparent, but that also doesn't mean that you have to be super excessive with your killings. And when it comes to having your queer and trans characters having tragic backstories or tragic stories within the current plot, just remember that while you can have events that happen to your queer and trans characters that cause them distress, that cause them pain, Also remember that queer and trans joy are things that exist and should be highlighted and celebrated within your stories as well. At the end of the day, accurate and authentic representation of queer and trans people in the media isn't going to absolve the world of queerphobia or transphobia. And queer and trans characters can and should be allowed to be flawed and messy and make mistakes. However, as writers, and especially if we are writers that are writing about experiences that are not our own, we have a responsibility to not perpetuate overtly harmful stereotypes about marginalized groups in our writing. Because media in all forms is often utilized to subtly and covertly circulate damaging stereotypes about marginalized groups to further fuel prejudice about these groups, which can be especially effective if these aren't groups that people are regularly coming into contact with. For example, if someone doesn't know an openly trans person in their personal life, then their only exposure to what trans people are like may be through the characters that they see on TV. I said this in part 1, but I'll say it again. When you're writing characters from marginalized groups that you yourself are not a part of, or identities that don't reflect your lived experience, it is so crucial to do your research. And your research should look like consuming media made by people whose identities reflect the characters you're looking to portray in your stories. I have a video about queer book recommendations that's already up on my channel, but just to give you some recommendations off the top of my head. Last Night at the Telegraph Club by Melinda Lowe, which is a personal favorite of mine, Hijab Butch Blues by Lamia H, Zammy by Audre Lorde, and The Transgender Issue by Sean Fay are all incredible books that I would definitely recommend that you start with. As for TV and film, I'd really recommend The Last of Us on HBO Max, or just Max as it's called now. I'm gonna make a whole video about The Last of Us because it's just so gay and I absolutely love it to pieces. I'm also just a really big fan of The Last of Us as a franchise, and because it's a post-apocalyptic story, it also kind of touches on some of the points I made in my Bury Your Gaze section of the video. I also really recommend Rafiki. It's a Kenyan film about two queer Kenyan girls who are the daughters of political rivals and they fall in love. You can find it on YouTube. It's a really excellent watch. Though I will warn you that there is a pretty graphic mob scene in the latter half of the movie. I don't remember the exact timestamp off the top of my head, but I'm sure that you can find it somewhere on the internet if you want to skip over that scene. But without spoiling the ending, the film doesn't end on as dark of a note as you might think it would due to that mob scene, so take that for what you will, use your best discretion, but I do really recommend this film. There are a lot of sweet moments in it. And for video games, I really recommend Butterfly Soup. I actually made a video about the game last year because I absolutely love it so much, and it's free to play on itch.io. It's this beautiful visual novel about 4 queer Asian girls. One of them is non-binary, and it's all just super gay, and I love it so much. It is one of my favorite games of all time. It is so fucking good. I also highly recommend Life is Strange True Colors. You get some really great bisexual representation in the protagonist, Alex Chen. And as of The Last of Us stan, I've also got to mention, of course, The Last of Us Left Behind, and especially The Last of Us Part 2, which has some really wonderful trans rep in the form of Lev, portrayed by trans actor Ian Alexander, who I absolutely adore. That's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you guys found these videos helpful, and let me know down below in the comments what other tropes, stereotypes you're sick of seeing in regards to queer and trans people in the media down below in the comments. I couldn't cover all of them in these videos, and I'm sure there's also just plenty that I'm not aware of, so leave them down below in the comments. I would love to make future videos like these ones where I talk about other tropes. One thing that I specifically didn't cover in these videos is queerbaiting, and that's because I felt that that subject deserved its own separate video. So if you're wondering why I didn't mention it at all in part 1 or part 2, that's why. Also, please feel free to leave your recommendations for any queer and trans rep in any form of media down below in the comments. I am always looking for new books, shows, movies, video games to consume, so please leave those recommendations if you have them in the comments. Also, I'd quickly like to take a moment to say thank you again for all the love and support that you guys showed on part 1 of this video. It genuinely means so much to me. Thank you to everyone who watched, who liked, who commented. It was just, it made my heart so happy because I worked really hard on both of these videos, and just knowing that you guys really enjoyed that video as well just makes me so happy. Thank you so much. Once again, that's all I have for today's video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I upload Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays, except when I don't, and I will see you guys in my next video. Bye, guys.